Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Fortified, Sanguine, Quaking, and as always, Prideful. We're actually back now at the point in the affix calendar where I've already got This Week in M Plus videos for this set of affixes. However, so normally last season I think I switched at this point to doing more of a analytical and not doing dungeon by dungeon and looking at statistics from the last time this set of affixes came around. This time around, I've decided to not do that yet. I might switch to doing that at some point in the next couple of weeks, but it feels like so much has changed since 12 weeks ago when we first had this combination of affixes that any analysis looking at the data from back then wouldn't really hold through. I'll show you guys though the site that I would use for this sort of video if I was making it, and this will be a useful site particularly later in the week to take a look at some trends. So this is mplus.subcreation.net, and you can go and look at a specific affix week, and in addition to ranking the difficulty statistically of the different affixes against each other and the different dungeons against each other, it can show you what specs are doing on different weeks. I wouldn't put too much weight into particularly these specific tier lists that it's generated are based on the runs from 12 weeks ago, right? And a tremendous amount has changed. So I wouldn't say that this is something that will be super useful to look at. I mean, you can just see this data from 16 to 22s, when 22 was the highest key that was being done the last time this affix combination was out, and now that's going to be 25s, 26s, maybe 27 this week, potentially, given the buffs to the tanks. All tanks getting buffed, except for Vengeance, which is staying about the same. Which, if you haven't heard about that, you can check out my most recent video before this one to learn more about the tank buffs. So anyways, I wouldn't use this site early in the week for any kind of analysis of how well different specs are doing. It will be more accurate later in the week, as it will be populated with runs from this week instead of from 12 weeks ago. And also this analysis of which dungeons are easy versus hard. It's also, I mean, this is again, it's looking at data specifically from the top N runs, in this case, the top 3,000 runs from that time. So it's not necessarily the easiest dungeons at like a plus 15 level for a weekly key. I do think it maps fairly closely though. So this is a cool website for that kind of analysis in particular, and I may switch to making videos more about that in the future. Another little tip about this website is if you're ever interested in what builds are good for your spec, this I think is the most unambiguously useful part of the site, because I think there's a lot of people have different concerns with the way that the tier lists are generated, and I think there's a lot of, any kind of purely statistically generated something like this requires some human analysis before it becomes super useful. But one thing that I think is just unambiguously useful right out of the tin is if you click through onto any spec, you can see what talents, legendaries, soulbind abilities, all the different, anything you might even be interested in knowing. Even if you want to know, what should I be enchanting on my rings, right? What stats should I be prioritizing? All of that kind of information is answered on this site based on those top level runs of Mythic Plus. So this is a really useful resource if you are playing a spec that you're unfamiliar with in Mythic Plus. If you want to see what builds are popular on certain specs, which covenants and stuff are popular, all of those different kinds of things. It's a really, really useful site for. So that's my shout out for the start of the video this week. But again, not going to be doing a video all about that. Instead, I do want to just kind of quickly run through what's going on in each of the dungeons this week. And the big news this week is that this is basically the... So I said this 4 weeks ago when we were on Bursting Volcanic Fortified, but I think that this will be an even better push week because of those tank buffs that have come in. I think that the 2 weeks are about equal. Maybe the Bursting Volcanic one's slightly better in a vacuum, but it depends a little bit on the dungeon for really high key groups. But I think that this group is going to be better for a wider range of players. I think that Bursting is an affix that can be pretty punishing for a lot of groups, depending on what your healer's like, depending on what your DPS is like. That's an affix that can actually be pretty painful. There are some other really good Fortified weeks for super high key teams with optimized comps. Spiteful Grievous, Spiteful Volcanic fall into that range. But both of those weeks have affixes that can be very punishing for, again, depending on your group, depending on your roles that you have in the classes. So this week, I think is kind of not unambiguously, there is some difficulty this week. The Sanguine Affix and the Quaking Affix can both be challenging, but I don't think either one of those, particularly this expansion with the nerfed Sanguine, where it goes away after 20 seconds, compared to last expansion where it would last for a full minute on the ground. It's hard for there to be that many spots where Sanguine's going to get you in too much trouble. I think Sanguine Depths is maybe the most likely dungeon for that to happen, but most of these other dungeons I think are going to be pretty good candidates for places where there's not really too much, sanguine disasters that can happen. But we'll quickly go dungeon by dungeon, and I'll just point out a few spots that you're going to want to be careful. So the other side, you're going to want to be careful when you do an earn stun. If you kill stuff in an earn stun, you're going to have a hard time moving everything else unless you have a knock effect, right? So that's something you're going to want to be really, really careful of in the other side, is where you're using the urns. The big thing I would say to do is use them at the start of the pull, rather than try and use them at some point in the middle of the pull. That's often just kind of a good default strategy for them, but especially this week, you really want to make sure that stuff is not dying while everything else is stunned under it. There's not too much CC immune mobs in this dungeon. That will be a huge problem, though, with Sanguine. Halls of Atonement, so the mob that you're going to want to look for Sanguine difficulty, in my experience, has been the Houndmasters, where they'll leap and start channeling their rapid fire. This can be somewhat baited based on the positioning of your players, but mostly I think it's just a good idea to have a displacement effect or a knock ready to kill them, or you can focus them first, although usually it's the bears themselves that end up being the highest kill priority there. But yeah, these mobs are the least cooperative, right? They're archers, they don't move as a tank does, so you do want to be careful for that. My route here, by the way, okay, so every route that you can find, by the way, all my routes, I say this in every video, at a different point in the video, depending on when I remember that I'm supposed to say it. All my routes are available on Raider.io. You can pick them up. There'll be a link in the description below. They are the same as last week in basically all cases, although I will be changing the Halls of Atonement route on tyrannical weeks to get you a Pride onto Echelon going forward. But on Fortified weeks, we're going to keep doing this 80% Pride onto Halkias strat, which I generally like more in a vacuum. Okay. Mists, there are a couple of CC immune mobs here that can be annoying with Sanguine. The Tirna villagers in particular can be really toxic with it because they have a big health pool that you don't actually have to get all the way through it, but if they start Sanguine healing, that can be a disaster. So you really want to be careful with those. Again, they're big in CC immune and they have cast sequences. That's kind of the combination of things that make a mob tough with Sanguine is cast sequences, right? They'll go into these sequences of casting, and then they're not interruptible or CCable or knockable or whatever during those, and they have a lot of health, right? If they have more health than their friends. The Tirna villagers fit this mold perfectly. It's the same thing that the mechanized peacekeepers did back in the Motherlode, and that's what can make them so deadly with Sanguine. The good news is there's only one that most people pull in the dungeon. If you can't Night Fae open this log, then obviously you got to go kill this one as well. But almost everybody has a Night Fae in the group because they're such a popular DPS covenant, so it's not really something that I think is that realistic that you wouldn't be able to have it. But some groups, weird stuff happens. You put yourself in the group finder and you end up not having Night Fae in your group. So do watch out for that. Good news is, very little part of the dungeon. The rest of the dungeon, though, you do have to still respect the Sanguine Affix actually quite a bit in both the maze and in this area. So it is an Affix to remain aware of the whole way through. Plaguefall. Okay, Plaguefall. As always, quick reminder that the Gushing Slimes trigger on death affixes, so you want to watch out for that. It's not too bad with Sanguine usually. Usually it's still worth it to pull all of them at once, in my opinion, if you have a way to effectively do damage there. If you're entirely an AoE cap group, if you don't have something like a Fire Mage, it can be better to split it up, but even still, it's nice just for moving of the mobs to pull them all together, but you can split this up as needed, and just make sure that you're moving as stuff is dying so that it doesn't cause too much problems with Sanguine there. Sanguine Depths, okay, so this is the dungeon where I've had the most troubles with the Sanguine Affix, particularly with the new kind of pathing that we're doing in the ring area to make sure that we're extending the lantern buff, so you're kind of shooting over here and then U-turning back and trying to get over here and activate this next lantern in order to refresh stacks. You're walking back over a space you've already been, which anytime you're trying to do a U-turn, you need to make sure that you are either waiting 20 seconds for the Sanguine puddles to go away behind you. So if you're kiting a pack in one direction, then you need to run back through it. It can be a challenge in particular in this area, so just try and plan through that. The way that I would do it is I'd pull everything to the far side of the lantern, and then start dragging it towards this direction. And that way you're just doing everything in the direction that you intend to be going. You already kind of need to do this out anyways because of the Growing Mistrust ability, so that, counterplay is the same there. But of course, one complicating factor is that the research scribes are extremely uncooperative, right? These are archer mobs as well, so they will not move unless you line of sight them so that they'll move themselves, or you outrange them, or you use a displacement effect on them, which you should to manage them as needed. But I mean, through this entire dungeon, displacement effects need to be really carefully used to manage Sanguine if you have any in your group. It's going to make your life a lot easier because every single pull in here is tricky with Sanguine, and you have Quaking to deal with as well, which is, I mean, you already have some of your ground space denied from where the Sanguine is, and it's already a narrow corridor. So this is really the one dungeon this week, I would say, where you'd maybe not think that these affixes are a good combination, right? This is it's a tough combo of affixes, although most affixes in this dungeon have some way that they screw you. The other thing to watch out for is that it's the cadets that trigger on death affixes in the run here. So most of these mobs aren't going to trigger on death affixes, but this set of cadets will. You do not want a Sanguine Heal General Call, so do your absolute best to avoid that happening. All right. Dude, I'm like 95% sure it's the cadets that do it, but now I'm kind of starting to second guess myself. So if there's check the pinned comment if you're about to do Sanguine Depths, and if it's not the cadets that trigger on death affixes, somebody will be very annoyed and will correct me, and I'll pin the comment. As long as they're not too mean to me, and and then you can then we'll know for sure which ones trigger the undeath affixes in this area. Although I'm 99.9% sure it's the Sanguine cadets. Okay, Spires of Ascension. This bug's finally been fixed. For anybody who has been following along, this is one of the longest lasting bugs. Was this pull up here being uncooperative and evading basically every time you pulled it? That's been fixed now as well. So that's good news. I think that was fixed for last week as well, so I might have mentioned this in last week's video too, but it's a very welcome change. The Spires route, so the with skips route continues to be pretty ambitious. I would say it's the most difficult route with skips that I have to execute successfully. It's one of the most like high key route that it's pretty close to what you might see key push teams do, or teams doing 20s, 22s, that kind of stuff. Because it's a pretty fast, pretty speedy way to get through the dungeon, right? You're getting through the dungeon 21 pulls, including one pull for each of the angels and all the bosses tagged in here as well as pulls. That's pretty fast for this dungeon. So do not be afraid to slow this down. If you want to still just generally move through the dungeon in this order, but split all of these pulls in half, that's totally fine as well. But these are combinable pulls. With Sanguine in particular, you're going to have to be really careful, though, because you have mobs like the Dark Praetors, which do not move cooperatively. You have mobs like the Forsworn Goliaths, which kind of fit into that range where they can spend a while casting, they have more health than their friends, and they're CC immune. So that means that you need to be careful about dropping Sanguine Puddles underneath them. So this pull in particular can be really tricky for your tank to manage the Sanguine Affix, especially because it just, with no affixes active already, this pull is extremely hard on Fortified. So be really careful if you're trying this one at home. Really consider splitting it up into two. And if you're going to do that, actually, what this note suggests, and I think is a good strategy, is sneak around first and do this part first, because you're going to have a pride buff, and then U-turn and clean up this easier pull. But not a big deal. However you want to attack that. Right, Necrotic Wake. Sanguine a little bit annoying in this dungeon, but I would say it's not one of the ones where Sanguine is a huge existential threat. It actually would be. It would be in this Necropolis if it lasted for a minute, I believe. But because it goes away so fast, you really don't have to deal with it too much, polluting your like middle of the room space for future pulls. So it's really not an affix I think that you'll feel too badly at all in here. So yeah, that's enough of that. Oh, hey, by the way, one thing I didn't mention. This is not related to Necrotic Wake at all, but one thing I didn't mention. These Nagi, the guy who makes MDT, updated it so that it smooths the outlines around the pulls now. Looks really nice, so make sure you update your MDT if you haven't, because it really does make the routes look a lot cleaner. Okay, finally, Theater of Pain. Couple of spots here that you're going to want to watch out for Sanguine for. The one thing I saw, actually, we learned in the MDI, was that sometimes if you have something die under Kultharok, it will give Sanguine buff to it. Apparently sometimes it doesn't. I've only seen it happen like once, and it did heal the boss. So if you're a group that likes to skip through these Shackled Souls and then pull them under the boss during the boss encounter, which it's really not that popular a strategy on live anyways, but especially with Sanguine, you need to be really careful doing that. So if that is something that you like to do, often this one up here, for instance, likes to vibe out in this area. You might miss it and then remember to tag it during the boss fight. Just be really careful with that Sanguine. Don't run the risk of full healing the boss. That is not something that you want to do. There are a couple of mobs as well in this area, like Portal Guardians that can potentially do the like chain cast in Sanguine. Dark Speakers as well. A couple of their casts, right? The Death Winds, the Curse of Desolation as well, I think, are not interruptible. So those can also potentially get a little bit of Sanguine healing. In practice, that's not something that I think is too big of a risk as long as you're aware of it and there's not too much else going on those pulls. Because in my experience, Sanguine is the most problematic when the pull's already hard and you have to use all your brain cells on the pull and you don't have enough left over for Sanguine. And my experience is that most of the stuff that would be a Sanguine threat in this wing, you have enough brain cells to just be thinking about it, but make sure you do think about it. This wing, not too much Sanguine problems as well because everything is nice and cooperative. The main thing you want to do is make sure you don't get a Sanguine puddle under an Arbalist if you don't have a way to displace it. But that's easy enough. Just make sure you're thinking about it and moving the mobs away from the Arbalist before they die. And then this wing, so this particular part of this wing, I would say is one of the most Sanguine annoying areas because of these mobs like to leap around. Depending on what path you're doing through this dungeon, some groups like to pull this entire like 12 mobs all together at the same time. If you're doing that, Sanguine is hugely dangerous because the mobs like to leap around. So make sure you're standing in such a spot where if the mobs leap to you, they're not going to leap into Sanguine. That's a big thing that everybody in your group will need to do. My route kind of avoids this room, pretty much entirely, right? We come in, we pull this guy, then we skip, and then we'll pull these guys later when we come back out. And that usually makes the Sanguine pretty easy to deal with in this area, and that facilitates good pride timings with the width skips route in here. So kind of naturally does it, but you're still going to have to worry about Sanguine in these pulls. These pulls are also naturally very tricky for Sanguine. So I would say that these are the most dangerous Sanguine pulls in the dungeon. One thing you can do is like pull this pull back a little bit, and then you can pull this guy by itself, pull it back up right up to the top of the stairs here, and you can pull this pull. You deal with this in the middle of the bridge now, and you don't have a lot of Sanguine, right? Sanguine's not encroaching on your play space, and then you move up to these two, and easy, and spawn your pride into boss, win the dungeon, collect your valor points, Titan Forge some items. Not something you do anymore, but I guess you can. That's sort of what valor points do to do your items. So, anyways, those are the dungeons. Hope this video helped. Let me know what you think of it and everything, and check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Ratnos, where I'll be streaming tonight, as of the time this video coming out, when we do our raid reclear. Stream every Tuesday and Monday for raid, and then undisclosed other times potentially. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.